This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. When I teach Marx's Capital Volume 1, the first chapter introduces us to the idea of value. And value, according to Marx, is socially necessary labour time. Now, in teaching it, invariably, the student will pipe up and say, what happens when there is a firm that doesn't employ any labour? Does that mean that they produce no value? And this question has become more and more, I think, significant in recent years, given the looming idea of artificial intelligence taking over a lot of the activities of human labour. And it's a perfectly reasonable question, but it has, I think, a very intriguing answer, and I think I want to spend a little time thinking about the nature of this answer. Part of the answer arises in a later chapter in Volume 1 of Capital, Chapter 11, about rate and mass of surplus value, which poses the question, are capitalists more interested in the mass of surplus value that they get, or interested in the rate at which they're getting it? Now, most people, since they know Marx talked a lot about the falling rate of profit and all of that, tend to sort of drift into the idea that Marx is saying that capitalists prefer to think about the rate. In fact, in practice in that chapter, he really points out that they're interested in the mass, because it's the mass that gives them the power. And it is the mass that, say, the Koch brothers and the Waltons and so on control, which gives them the power. So they want to augment their mass. And changing the rate in that chapter that I've just mentioned is really about trying to find a way to increase the mass. Now, Marx in that chapter also comes across another paradox, and let me read it to you, because he's very alert, I think, to the way in which socially necessary labour time is contingent upon the nature of the technology and the nature of the production process. So he says towards the end of this chapter that the masses of value and surplus value produced by different capitals vary according to the labour they employ. This signals a contradiction. Everyone, he says, knows that a cotton spinner who employs a great deal of means of production and very little labour does not, on account of this, pocket less profit or surplus value than a baker who sets in motion relatively much labour power and very little means of production. For the solution of this apparent contradiction, says Marx, many intermediate terms are still needed. Now, when Marx says something like that, you know that somewhere else in his vast amount of work, you're going to find a solution to this particular contradiction. Or if not a solution to it, what might be called an elaboration of it, which explains how the contradiction works. And since we also know that when Marx was writing Volume 1 of Capital, he'd already produced the notes which became the basis of the Volume 3 of Capital, we immediately go to Volume 3 to see what he says about this. And the answer is given in the chapter in Volume 3, which is about the equalization of the rate of profit. Capitalists, when they're working in the market, are interested in the profit rate, not the rate of surplus value, which is the amount which is coming from the exploitation of living labour in production. And since they compete with each other and over the profit rate, the tendency in the long run will be for the profit rate to converge, and you would get a standard profit rate in which all companies, all firms, no matter whether they were employing a lot of labour or not, would get the same rate of profit. If this is the case, then what in effect happens is we get a transfer of value from those companies and firms and regions and all the rest of it which are engaging in labour-intensive activities to those regions, firms and sections of society which are engaging in capital-intensive modes of production. In other words, there is a transfer of value from labor-intensive to capital-intensive forms of production. This can be referred to, if you like, as a form of sort of capitalist communism. And I guess the best way to look at it is that what Marx is suggesting is that the surplus value depends on the labor input on one part, but also the distribution of that goes elsewhere. And the rule is this, that from each capitalist according to the labor they employ, and to each capitalist according to the capital they advance. Now, what this means then is that there is, if you like, a subsidy which flows from capital-intensive forms of production to a subsidy that flows from labor-intensive forms of production and labor-intensive economies to economies which are capital-intensive. Now, this transfer of value occurs through competition over the rate of profit in the market. And I think this raises kind of some very interesting questions. For instance, if you are a decision maker and you want to decide what kind of industrialization you want, do you want labor intensive or do you want capital intensive? And the answer there is, if you get labor intensive forms, you're going to transfer value to the capital intensive forms. So a sensible decision maker would say, I don't want to industrialize with labor intensive industry. And the one economy that I think is a very good example of this is Singapore. Singapore, when it was thrown out of the Malaysian Federation in the early 1960s, had to figure out what it was going to do and what kind of industrial strategy it was going to have. And what Singapore decided was that they were not going to go for labor-intensive activities of the sort that were in Hong Kong and elsewhere. They were going to go to capital-intensive. And that's what they did. And what happened in Singapore is, I think, a very good example of the advantages that attach to engaging in capital-intensive forms of production. Now, this transfer and subsidy is something which has to be looked at. So this means that through the equalization of the rate of profit, what we get is a transfer of value from the labor-intensive economies and firms to the capital-intensive economies and firms. Now, this transfer is sustained then, and it therefore, I think, helps explain why it is that economies which are of low productivity, when they get inserted into a situation where they're competing with highly productive economies, end up subsidizing the more intensive, capital-intensive economy. For example, when Greece entered the European Union, Greece had a labor-intensive, low-productivity economy. But in relationship to Germany, which has a capital-intensive economy, in effect, what happens through this Marx mechanism we're talking about is that Greece subsidizes Germany. Now, that's going to come as a huge shock to the Germans, because the Germans are convinced that the money they're lending to the Greeks is because the Greeks are lazy and idle and don't do any kind of decent work. No, the problem for Greece is they have a low productivity labor regime. And that means that no matter how hard they work, most of the value they create is going to be siphoned off to Germany. So this is the way this economy works. And right now we're beginning to see, I think, something that's very important, which is a fight over capital intensity and what economies can be capital intensive. And I'll get back to the mechanisms of this in a short while, but the basic thing here is that China has a labor-intensive economy, but has recently announced that it's going to move towards a more capital-intensive economy. If it does that, then the transfer of value that occurs from China to the capital-intensive economies of Europe and the United States and all the rest of it is going to diminish. So that there is a battle going on, and part of the battle that's going on between Trump and the Chinese is over intellectual property rights and over technology. Now, technology is, of course, the handmaiden of capital intensity. So what the United States is trying to do is to prevent the transfer of technological know-how to China, so that China is kept in a state of a low, of a labor-intensive economy. But China cannot sustain labor intensity anymore, partly for demographic reasons. They're running into shortages of labor, and partly for other reasons that have to do with the nature of the market. So in effect, the labor-intensive forms of production are being moved out of China into Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and even Bangladesh. Now, here I think it's useful to look at the trajectory of, say, Singapore, which chose a capital-intensive path, and Bangladesh, that has a labor-intensive path. Now, you can see immediately that actually Bangladesh is really a very troubled economy and has is not doing very well at all, even though it is producing a great deal of value because of all of the labor it employs. On the other hand, Singapore is acquiring a great deal of value, even though it is not employing that much labor. So there's a transfer going on, if you like, from Bangladesh to, and economies like Bangladesh to Singapore. So part of the tense relation that now exists between the United States and China is over capital transfer. And the Chinese attempt and statement that by 2025 they're going to have shifted to a capital-intensive economy, which of course would then be a rival to the United States. Now, I think it's generally acknowledged within the Marxist circles. For instance, Michael Roberts points out recently that the way in which there is a transfer of value from the poor capitalist economies with lower levels of technology to the rich imperialist economies has been greatly neglected by Marxist economists in the recent period. And I would want to emphasize the importance of this of this transfer. So, what is it then that is really going to what is it we're going to see through this transfer of value from labor-intensive to capital-intensive sectors and economies? And here I think what we begin to see is that there is a tendency for those areas which are capital-intense to draw to themselves much greater capital intensity. Now, this is something that was laid out much earlier in a non-Marxist way, in a Keynesian way, by Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal. And what he basically did was to say, look, there is a mechanism that exists, but by means of which rich regions get richer while poor regions either stagnate or decline under conditions of free trade and profit equalization. This process Myrdal called circular and cumulative causation. And it occurs because capital is inevitably attracted to the dynamic cities, sectors and regions, draining the less dynamic cities, sectors and regions of their wealth, population, resources, talents and skills. And Marx actually also noticed this dynamic. And here I quote from him in Capital. Ease of commerce and the consequent acceleration in the turnover of capital gives rise to an accelerated concentration of both the centre of production and its market. With this accelerated concentration of people and capital at given points, the concentration of these masses of capital in a few hands makes rapid progress. In other words, what we're dealing with in capitalist economies is a kind of a sucking sound where value is being extracted from the whole of the world, and it's being agglomerated in areas of great capital intensity and technological advantage. So in fact, what this says is that there is a tendency, and this is something which I think has been remarked about the capitalist economy in these times, is a tendency to sort of say the metropoles or the metropolitan areas are the big centers of which are drawing in all of the talent, all of the capital, and actually becoming the centers of capitalist dynamics and capitalist growth, and also the centers where great fortunes are going to be made. If you look at the United States, for example, I think you would end up finding that about 2/3 of the GDP of the United States is actually created in about a dozen of the largest metropolitan centers. If you take, Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York and Atlanta and Chicago and Seattle and so on. So the metropoles have started to become great magnets for surplus for both capital and for talent. Now, this is an interesting kind of process because the classical and later neoclassical economists anchored their arguments on the supposed neutrality and inherent fairness of perfectly functioning markets. But what you're now seeing is perfectly functioning markets when they're associated with the equalization of the rate of profit actually turn out to be unfair markets. So that the assumption that a market system can be fair is destroyed through the equalization of the rate of profit. And therefore, the most unfair way in which a capitalist system can be organized is to have a market system through which the equalization of the profit rate occurs. Now, in what eras do we have the equalization of the rate of profit? And this is something which has to be looked at historically. Marx, in effect, says the equalization of the rate of profit creates unfair structures of trade in which the rich regions grow richer and the poor regions grow poorer. And the rich nations grow richer and the poor nations grow poorer. So that is Marx's argument, whereas, of course, the neoclassical economics argument is, fair market is fair trade, and that therefore they're going to produce egalitarian outcomes. Whereas Marx's argument is no, you're going to produce highly concentrated forms of wealth and privilege. Now, but actually, when Marx was writing, there was not really a very good system for equalizing the profit rate. And the reason for that is that for many commodities, the transport costs were very high. And there were a lot of tariffs and barriers to trade. And so in the 1860s, the capacity to equalize the profit rate very far in the global economy was not that strong. But it began to be stronger because of innovations in communications and transport. So that the coming of the railroads and the coming of the steamships and the telegraph and all this kind of thing meant that there could be at least equalization of prices on major commodities across the world, so that traders in London would have information about wheat prices in Buenos Aires and Odessa and Chicago, and so there was, if you like, a closer approximation to equalizing the rate of profit through transport and communications. But what we see later on is the construction of a global trading system where the equalization of the rate of profit was not a priority. The Bretton Woods Agreement, for example, was an agreement in which capital could not easily move around the world. There were capital controls. So that, in effect, the United States economy was not a closed economy, but was relatively closed because it was very hard to move capital in and out of the United States. And the result of that was that you would look at the U.S. economy as if it was an economy in its own right. and there would be workers struggling within that economy for advantages, and the labour movement would be working within it. And the organisation of production within that economy could even have a monopolistic character, so that, for example, if you read the classic text on monopoly capitalism by Baran and Sweezy, what they would say is that Detroit was a very good example of a monopoly, of what monopoly capitalism is about. In this case, just three major firms which did price leadership and were involved with each other. But as far as Sweezy and Baran and Sweezy were concerned, that was the kind of typical example you would use when you wanted to talk about monopolistic structures. There was no competition in the 1960s from, say, German and Japanese firms. They came in much later, 70s and 80s, and of course, labour struggled for an advantage within the United States, as it did within Britain, as it did within France, as it did within Germany. So we could talk about a German working class, a French working class, an British working class, and an American working class. And each one of those working classes could seek advantage within a terrain because they were largely protected from having to compete with labour in all the other economies in the world because of this system of capital controls. And this system of capital controls lasted up until the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, which occurred when the dollar went off the gold standard in 1971. And it was at that point that labour suddenly found itself having to compete with all of the labour elsewhere in the world. Before that, its only competition came through the organisation of immigration from elsewhere. So Germany imported Turkish labour. France imported labour from North Africa, the Maghrebian labour. The Swedes imported labour from Yugoslavia and Portugal. The British imported labour from its once upon a time imperial area, from South Asia and from West Indies. And the United States opened up its immigration system in 1965. So that during the 1960s, the main problem for labour came from the way in which immigration was being deployed to try to undermine both the labour laws and to undermine also the labour capacities. And what that led to then was the rise of a certain anti-immigrant sentiment within many of the working class movements across Europe and even to some degree in the United States. And we're seeing that, of course, very much revived right now. But in 1970s, suddenly capital controls were abolished, and capital could start to move freely from one part of the world to the other. In other words, in 1970s, we get the situation in which the mobility of capital, both through technological change and communications and all the rest of it, and through the falling away of these other barriers of capital controls, that finally, after the 1980s in particular, we start to see the emergence of a situation where the equalization of the profit rate becomes more and more significant. So what I'm suggesting here is that actually the historical conditions under which the equalization of the profit rate was going to be set up were lacking throughout much of the 19th century and right the way through up until the end of the Bretton Woods period. But that what has really marked what the period of globalization has been about since the 1980s onwards has been that equalization of the profit rate could occur, which means that during this period then we're likely to see much more transfer of value going on from labor-intensive economies to capital-intensive economies. In other words, the distinction between labor-intensive and capital-intensive economies has moved to the fore, and it's therefore become now a focus of struggle, a fierce struggle to try to prevent certain areas of the world becoming capital-intensive. And this is what the United States is trying to do in relationship to China right now. I mean, why is the United States so upset at the fact that China wants to become a capital-intensive economy by 2025? Why are they so upset with the technology transfers which have occurred from China or to China, and why therefore is there this big struggle over intellectual property rights, which is the main thing, which is actually creating the problems right now in the negotiations between Trump and the Chinese. So we have then a situation where historically the contrast between labor-intensive and capital-intensive economies was not so significant, even though Marx saw it as a theoretically significant and theoretically important when he was writing Capital in the middle of the 19th century. But we've now got to the point where what Marx saw as being a possible feature of a capitalist economy in a pure state has now actually arrived. And this is therefore why we're seeing this huge kind of conflict between the United States and China. And I will continue talking about that next time. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.